got another book haul for you, and what I have with me today are all the books that I hauled in the month of July, and it was a lot because I had opportunities to go to some bookstores in different states as I was traveling to the new location that I have moved to. I am still in temporary housing, so there may be problems in the future for me once we move out in a couple of months, because, yeah, like I mentioned, it's a lot. All right, let's get going. The first book is a work of historical fiction, and sorry, the foiling is kind of wearing off, but it is called This Thing of Darkness by Harry Thompson. And this book is set in 1828, and it is a novel about Robert Fitzroy, who is the captain of the HMS Beagle, and his friendship with Charles Darwin. Yeah, that should be interesting. And apparently it was a very rocky relationship. But it is described as a page-turning action adventure combined with subtle intellectual arguments. Next up, I have Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, and this is a book that I happened to find just within a few days after Kat and Alex at Kat's Novel Adventure and Alex at Frank Fiction mentioned that they were hosting a book club and that their book pick for August was Neverwhere, so perfect time to pick it up. And as far as I understand, this book is about Richard Mayhew, who's living a fairly ordinary life until one day he discovers a injured girl on the sidewalk, and then adventure ensues from there that takes place in the London Underground, both meaning like the London Underground subway stations, as well as apparently the tunnels and maybe the sewer system as well. Yeah, sewer tunnels. And so it kind of reminds me of like Drood and Charles Dickens and yeah, going into the London Underground literally. And I have heard a lot about Neil Gaiman. This will be the first book I've ever read by him. I know he tends to write fantasy. This definitely sounds like there's at least magical realism in it. It has sort of a dark gothic sort of thriller vibe. So we'll see how I like it, and hopefully I enjoy it. All right, next I have Jennifer Government by Max Berry. This is a book that's been on my TBR for a while. I don't even remember where I heard about it anymore. But yeah, it is a dystopian novel that is set in the future, and it's a time where it's sort of like a brave new corporate world is how it describes it on the back, where everybody basically has a job, but their last name is now tied to their employer. So, for example, Jennifer clearly works for the government. And it also features a merchandising officer named Hack Nick. Or no, sorry, that would be Hack Nike because he works for Nike. But as part of his job, he needs to build some street credit for the new line of sneakers that they're coming out that requires him to shoot the customers. And Jennifer Government is on the job. This is supposed to be pretty zany. As far as I understand, it's supposed to be a satirical novel about globalization and marketing hype. So yeah. I also picked up The Hollow Beast by Christophe Bernard, and this was translated from French. And as far as I understand, this is supposed to be a romping comedy ride that follows a sort of disaster during a hockey event that leads to family feuds. So two families are feuding and one is seeking revenge, and it lasts across multiple generations, over 100 years, and may involve some high-proof hooch that is causing hallucinations of a multicolored beast that future generations of the family also see. It sounds strange and kind of, if it works out, right up my alley. So hockey, family feuds, and magical beasts, yeah, I'm here for it. I also have Taylor Jenkins Reid, Carrie Soto is back, and if this seems like an unusual pick for me, it is, and it's because this book, as well as the next one, Shark Heart, a love story, are two books that were actually found in the home that I'm renting. And so I'm just going to put them on my bookshelf and use them as part of my TBR until I move out, because if nothing else, they're free books. I have not read anything by Carrie Soto. I have not read anything by Taylor Jenkins Reid before, but I have heard things about her. So we'll see how I like this. I've seen people haul this book, but I haven't seen anybody really talk about it. I don't feel like it's a great place to start with Taylor Jenkins Reid, but I'm going to do it anyway. So all I know is that this is supposed to be a sports, I believe, tennis story that is about Carrie Soto, who was past retirement, past greatness, and is trying to make a comeback and show everybody that she's still got it. So hopefully it'll be an inspiring read. The next book I am even less sure of. Shark Heart, A Love Story. And in case you were wondering, yeah, let me just read the opening here. A gorgeous debut novel of marriage, motherhood, metamorphosis, and letting go. This intergenerational love story begins with newlyweds Ren and her husband Louis, a man who, over the course of 9 months, transforms into a great white shark. We'll see. Okay, so I didn't mention this, but I did try to kind of divide the books loosely by genre. So that first section was probably the more contemporary feeling books, at least in terms of style of read, even though there was some historical fiction mixed in there with it. And in fact, this next book is actually historical fiction as well, though I feel like also literary fiction. So I found this a really nice Everyman's Library edition of 2 of Peter Carey's works, Oscar and Lucinda, and the True History of the Kelly Gang. And the interesting thing about this is the book that I was actually looking for was Oscar and Lucinda, but I was able to pick this up at less than half price, and so for me, 2 to 1, it made sense. I did want to read the History of the Kelly Gang as well, but it wasn't a book I was particularly looking for at that moment. Oscar and Lucinda is a very strange sounding story. It is a love story, but it features an Anglican minister who gambles with the instructions of the divine, who then meets an heiress who has inherited a glassworks company, and then at some point they try to transport a glass church across the Australian outback. I have no idea. And the second book, The True History of the Kelly Gang, is supposed to be narrated by the Australian outlaw Ned Kelly himself and is a fictional account from his perspective of his life and his gang and how things happened while he is simultaneously being pursued. And apparently the retelling and the account of this gang is considered epic, both in style and storytelling. I have Bone China by Roma Tearne, and this is a book about a family who finds themselves in the midst of ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, and they have to leave their very lush tea estate to immigrate to London. And there they have to start a very different life, and it is about how some of them are able to adapt, the missing of home that occurs for some, and just the struggle to find themselves a new life. And it features themes of hope and survival and I'm sure immigration. And so, yeah, very interesting to read this. I know nothing about Sri Lankan culture or the people or, the situations, really even any of the history. So I'm hoping that this will be a good introduction. Next up, I have bought Giles, A Goat Boy. I have never heard of this book before. In fact, most of these I've never heard of before. But this one, when I read the back, I was like, I need to know more. So I'm just going to read to you what it says here because there's no other way to describe this. So the community of New Tammany College is on the brink of destruction. Polarized into hostile East and West campuses, the student body holds itself hostage with the power of mutual destruction, known as WestCAC. A monstrous computer system so complex it can simulate all human activity, from calculations to emotions. George Giles, a parentless boy raised by billy goats, is the only person who can penetrate and deprogram the terrible WestCAC. With the aid of his innovative ideology and the lovely Anastasia, he sets out to save New Tammany in an outrageously ribald, farcical adventure with broad implications for the modern world. What? A goat boy who is saving a split campus from AI? Is that what I'm hearing here? That's what it sounds like to me. The next book was a pure viewer recommendation by, and that was for Praiseworthy by Alex Wright. This was recommended to me by one of my viewers, Anne, and this also has a very intriguing premise. So it is about Aboriginal life, or it's at least an Aboriginal story. It is set in a small town in North Australia and covers what, as far as I can tell, is climate fiction, as well as addressing issues of oppression, greed, assimilation, perhaps even industrialization. And the names of the people in this book are also kind of making me wonder if it's also an allegorical story. You have a main character whose name is Cosman Steele. There's a character named Country, his wife is Dance, and their son's name is Aboriginal Sovereignty, who just wants to walk into the sea. And so while I know that I believe these are translated Aboriginal names, I feel like in the context of this story, there's also a lot of double meanings going on. So I am very fascinated by this book. I actually kept seeing it at bookstores and being intrigued, but the back of the book really doesn't help you understand that much about what this book is about. And so it did take having somebody recommend that I read this book for me to finally pick up. The next book that I have is another book that has been on my TBR for a very long time, and that is The Instructions by Adam Levin. And I finally went to purchase this either earlier this year or at the end of last year, but saw that the Bar Mitzvah edition was coming out, and I was like, nope, there's no way, I'm waiting for that. So this particular edition of this extremely long book actually splits it into 2 volumes and has some amazing artwork on the cover. This book, from what little I know about it, is actually about a 10-year-old who is a scholar who gets expelled from 3 different Jewish day schools, and then he finally finds himself at a junior high where I believe he becomes a messianic-like figure there. So it's supposed to be a very strange but interesting story. The next book oddly has a similarly odd, deep, and creepy school theme going on. And that is The Catholic Book by Edoardo Albinati. And this is another huge mammoth of a book. This is a book that I've actually been looking for quite a while, and even online it can sometimes be hard to find. So I was thrilled, shocked, and surprised, which all mean somewhat the same thing, but we'll ignore that, when I found this on the shelf at a used bookstore. And so not only did I find the book, get to look through it, but it was also discounted. So all the things that I love. And this is a story that is set in 1975 in Italy and covers a fictional account of what was known as the Cercio massacre. And it follows the story of 3 young boys who are accused of let's just say violence, in a Catholic school. This book is supposed to cover and address a lot of the issues that were going on at the time in Italy, having to do with the bourgeoisie and sort of inherited, if you will, legacies, and just the violence and greed and corruption that could lead to. So I'm very fascinated in this story, and it is a long one. And this last stack of books moves us from more or less so literary fiction into much more solidly, I guess, classical works of fiction, somewhat from around the world. So let's get started with that. The first one is the Mahabharata. This is a book that I became interested in after reading Arabian Nights. I was reading a bit more about the construction and history of that story and found that some of it tied it back to works of Indian literature, particularly in some ways this one, including the idea of embedded narratives. And so this is a work of world literature, and it was written in Sanskrit and is the longest book, I believe, written in Sanskrit. It is written in verse originally. I don't think this particular edition is in verse. And it tells the story of the struggle between the Kurus and the Pandavas for land. So epic family struggling for land in a very versified and fantastical world. So I am very excited to read this book. I became even more excited when I realized that the book Upon a Burning Throne, which is a more recent fantasy novel, is actually written and inspired and basically a retelling of this book. And this was actually a book that I may be using for the hardest reading challenge you will ever do as a classic work and its adaptation. So we'll see, and you'll see that it was something that was picked for my August TBR. The next book I have is a work of classic Chinese fiction, and that is The Plum in the Golden Vase, or Qin Pin Mei. It is also known as The Golden Lotus, I believe. This particular translation of it is by David Todd Roy, and this book set is actually, this is volume 1 of, I think, a 5-volume book set of this. Otherwise, it is also a mammoth story running over 1,000 pages long, and it just depends on the binding and the translation as to how many books it ends up being put into. This is a very fascinating story to me. It is just a story of domestic life of this one gentleman and his sort of harem of 6 wives and concubines and all the things. It is supposed to be a story of realism and is supposed to have had major influence on the narrative form, which is why I'm really fascinated in it. I really love to read books from different countries, especially classic works, to just see how like the narrative form changed in works of fiction from those countries. And this is a book that, from my understanding, not only influenced the narrative form of stories in China, but also around the world. The next book I pick up is kind of a funny pick, and the back doesn't describe it well, and I don't know that much about it. It is called Journey to the End of the Night, and I have heard a few people talk about this book and how much they like it. The actual reason that I brought it up, though, is that it is the first book in a series, and it was the second book, which I will put up on the screen, that actually really intrigued me and that I wanted to read. But I'm kind of, a rule follower, so I was like, well, I can't read the second book unless I read the first book, even if they're not related. So thus I bought the first book so that I can read this to eventually one day read the second book. So I'm not going to read the back because I've done that already and it doesn't really clarify much to me. So we'll see what this book ends up being about. I was super excited to find a discounted version of Wilkie Collins' The Law and the Lady. Wilkie Collins is an author whose works I want to read in completion, and so anytime I find his books, especially if they're on sale, I pick them up. And I will not read the back of a Penguin Classic because they definitely spoil the plot for you. So I will just read this little quote from the book, which says, "I mean to win you back, a man vindicated before the world without a stain on his character." Ooh. I like that. And having read as many works of Wilkie Collins as I have, that's enough to tell me what may or may not have happened in this story, and I am intrigued. The next book is a funny pick. It is Indian Summer by William Dean Howells, and this is a book that I picked up because it's been on my TBR for a while, or so I thought, until I brought it home. And then I realized that this wasn't the book on my TBR. There was another book on my TBR with the same exact title by a different author. And I will put a picture of that up on the screen. What that other book is about, I don't really recall, but fortunately this book also sounds interesting. And it is about a gentleman named Theodore Colville who turns 40, has spent many years as a newspaper publisher, and then decides to move to Florence to sort of enjoy the rest of his life and hopefully fall romantically in love. He then meets there, I think, one of his past love's best friends, and then a friend that's traveling with her. And it seems like what follows is a bit of a love triangle and comedy of errors tropes going on. So it still sounds like something I'll enjoy, but hopefully one day I'll get the other Indian Summer as well. Continuing along with the theme and idea of love triangles, I also found this nice copy of Green Henry by Gottfried Keller, and this is a book that's been on my TBR also for a little bit of time, and it is about Henry, who struggles with his ambitions to become a successful painter, and then I believe he falls in love with one or maybe 2 girls and can't decide between them, so again, another love triangle, but featuring a painter, kind of reminded me a little bit of Van Gogh, and so yeah. I also picked up Wilkie Collins' book, The Evil Genius. Again, another book that was just a sheer Wilkie Collins buy. And again, I'm not going to read much of the back, but it says, when a year after her father's death, Sydney Westerfield's mother marries again and immigrates to America, she leaves her daughter in the care of her unmarried sister, who runs a school in London. And knowing Wilkie Collins, it's not going to be a good school, and there's going to be a lot of drama, and there's clearly an evil genius involved in there somewhere. So I want to know where. I had this lovely pick, an Archipelago book, which I really like the books that they put out, and I like the sort of formatting of their books. This is translated from Dutch, and it is called Eline Vere? Probably not. And this really intrigued me, one, because I mistook it for another book on my TBR, very similarly named girls in those stories. But it's supposed to be a psychological masterpiece that inspired Flaubert and Tolstoy. So, yeah, I'm interested in that. And as far as I know, this is a story of a young woman who is considered rather eccentric by her community, and then she does a very conventional thing in marrying a gentleman, and I believe is trying to figure out how to then get out of her conventional life. That is the best that I can figure out from how the inside cover describes this book. But I am looking forward to getting to this at some point. Okay, so that is everything that I purchased. I would hold them up, but it's way too much. So you did see the shot at the beginning, and I'm sure I'll have a lovely picture on the cover showing you all the things. So that is what I'm going to be reading. Let me know if you've read any of these books and if you have recommendations of ones for which I could or should start with. I always like to keep track of those, and they do come up in my TBR games sometimes. I hope you have lots of books that you're looking forward to reading, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!